Hello, I'm Nick Clark. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, France in Africa. Despite vowing to stop propping up strongmen on the continent, France is backing a Libyan warlord and Chad's dictator. Is it all about the oil? Well, forces loyal to Khalifa Haftar have blockaded oil ports and have stopped pipelines, strangling the economy of much-needed funds. Plus, getting it done. Brexit clears one hurdle, but the long slog continues. We find out what it means for one of the worst-performing industrial economies. So then, France has spent decades propping up strongmen in Africa. Many then welcomed France's newly elected President Emmanuel Macron, promising to end what's known as Francafrique when he came to power in 2017. But many say France is still up to its old games. In Libya, Macron has thrown in his lot behind the renegade general Khalifa Haftar, secretly supplying arms and training, despite the UN and Libya's former colonial power, Italy, backing the government in Tripoli. Both are trying to protect their economic interests in Libya's oil fields. France's biggest oil company, Total, recently took a stake in Libya's Waha concession. Paris is also keen to protect its political interest in the south, in the Sahel region. That's Mauritania, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Chad. And in Chad, while fighting so-called Islamist militants, it deployed warplanes to attack a rebel convoy, helping to keep President Idriss Deby in power. And Deby has faced several coup attempts since he came to power back in 1990. France also has 4,500 troops in the capital in Jazeera, where the United States also has a base. The European Union and France have pledged more than $1.4 billion to fund the G5 Sahel Anti-Terror Alliance. Most of the money will come from the European Emergency Trust Fund for Africa, which aims to reduce migration to the European Union. And sometimes letting go of your colonial past can be difficult. Even attempts to pull out of the West African common currency, which is linked to the euro, still forces the hand of nations to hold reserves with France's central bank. Well, joining us now from London is Paul MELLY. He's a consulting fellow for the Africa programme at Chatham House. Mr. MELLY, welcome to the programme. When Macron came to power in 2017, he made the case, didn't he, for peeling back on involvement, French involvement in Africa. But yet here he is backing Haftar, and he's thrown his weight behind Chadian leader Idriss Deby. What's happening here?
Well, really what Macron has presented is the case for a changed relationship with Africa, not so much a reducing or a retreat from the continent, but much more for putting the relationship onto a new footing. And you can see that most strongly in the relationship with the West African countries, and particularly the very troubled Sahel region on the margins of the Sahara, where Macron's argued the case for much more of a partnership approach, but also economic reforms. For example, he's declared France's readiness to support the reform of the CFA, the franc, the currency that's used in a lot of Francophone West Africa. But in terms of the level of engagement, he's actually deepened it. And we've seen an increase in the number of French troops in the Sahel, most recently with the announcement that the Barkhane force, that's the French deployment of forces across the region, is going to be increased by 600 troops in the next few weeks to more than 5,000. And he's repeatedly visited the countries of the Sahel. Countries like Mali and Niger have been a huge focus of French political and military engagement. In the case of Chad, he's maintained a traditional, long-standing French security partnership with the Chadian government. But that's more difficult for France in political terms because Chad is not a very democratic country. France has long-standing traditional economic and security interests in a range of countries from Chad right down through Central Africa that do not have such a good governance record.
Right.
And yet France feels it can't detach itself. That's more difficult. But the Sahel is the area where he's actually increased engagement.
Right, so you have all this going on in the Sahel region, then you have the Libya situation too. What overspill is there from the Libyan situation into the Sahel?
Well, there's a very direct link. even though in traditional policy terms, Libya was treated as part of the sort of Maghreb, Middle East region, and the Sahel is treated as part of West Africa, in fact, in the Sahara, there are very close relationships between countries both north and south. And so that meant several years ago when the French and British led international intervention in Libya in support of the rebels there, led to the eventual collapse of the Gaddafi regime, weapons from Libya flooded down into the Sahel. And Sahelians who had been engaged in the Gaddafi military forces returned to Mali and were an important factor in the destabilization of northern Mali. So there's a very close link in security terms, and there's also a link in human terms, because the fact that Libya is effectively not a functioning state without all the normal institutions and capacity to defend its borders that used to be the case, that, of course, opened up Libya as a channel for the huge flow of informal migrants a couple of years ago across the Sahara, principally from Niger in the Sahel through to the Libyan coast. There'd always been quite a strong movement of people, but the reason that a large informal migrant flow of people seeking to reach Europe could pass through Libya was because there was, in effect, no effective Libyan state machine to control that frontier.
Okay, let's move on to the currency. The regional currency has been the CFA franc, as you know, since 1945, backed by France. It will be renamed the ECO. To whose benefit is this, and what control will France still have over it?
Well, the biggest beneficiaries of the reform will actually be the members of the West African CFA franc bloc. There's another bloc of CFA countries in Central Africa who are thinking about reform but haven't decided yet. But the 8 West African countries, of which the most important economically are probably Côte d'Ivoire and Senegal, they will see a reduction in domestic political pressure. There'd been a lot of grassroots pressure, particularly from younger people and particularly from more radical voices in domestic politics, saying this currency linked to France still reeks of the colonial era and it's time to end it. So they will gain in political terms, those governments, because the name will take the pressure off a bit. And they will also gain an extra degree of control because France is withdrawing its representatives from the institutions that run the CFA franc system in West Africa, and the system under which these West African countries have to deposit half of their foreign exchange reserves in what's called an operations account, which is run by the French Treasury as a way of underpinning this whole arrangement. That will end.
Okay,
but they
I'm just going to jump in there because we're just running out of time, Mr. MELLY. I do apologise, but I just want to ask you one final question, and briefly, if you would. Does maintaining the French connection in Africa, does it make the region more stable or unstable?
On the whole, in recent years, it's tended to actually strengthen stability because the crisis with jihadism in the Sahel has been seen by West African countries generally as an existential threat to the stability and growth of the region. West Africa over the last 20, 30 years has mostly seen fairly steady economic growth despite local political problems in some countries. And that development progress risked being set back massively if, for example, Mali had been taken over by jihadist groups. But it's sometimes very difficult to manage the relationship in immediate political terms because the visible presence of French troops in West Africa is not always comfortable for local people. And in contrast to Central Africa, this is a region where the French presence hadn't really been military for the most part in the Sahel region in the decades after independence. The French were in some coastal countries like Senegal, like Côte d'Ivoire, but not in the Sahel in military terms.
Paul MELLY from Chatham House, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Well, Libya's oil production has slowed to a near halt after forces loyal to the warlord Khalifa Haftar blockaded ports and stopped pipelines. And shortages of basic goods and price hikes, well, they're expected to follow. Tony Bertley reports now from Libya's last functioning refinery in Zawiya, which is west of the capital, Tripoli.
A lone tanker just offshore from the Zawiya oil refinery waiting for a shipment of crude oil that may not come for some time. Zawiya is 40 kilometres west of the capital Tripoli and is the second largest of Libya's 6 refineries. Forces loyal to warlord Khalifa Haftar have blockaded the other 5 oil ports and closed a pipeline serving Zawiya. It's gone from handling 300,000 barrels of oil a day to 0. It's proving an effective weapon, leaving Libya's oil industry on the verge of collapse. It's something the Libyan government cannot solve by itself.
I think the government of Turkey, the government of Russia, the European Union, the United States come to realization that they stand by us and they stand against this military dictator who wants to control Libya.
Some sources believe that Khalifa Haftar may have agreed at the Berlin conference to measures aimed at ending the oil blockade, but no details have been given, nor a time frame, nor what he may want in return. And every day without a resolution pushes Libya closer towards an economic crisis. The warlord controls 2/3 of the country with well-resourced fighters who've been battling to take the capital Tripoli since last April. Libya is already suffering shortages of basic necessities such as gas for domestic use, even though it is a producer. The oil squeeze will only make matters worse.
It's going to affect everyone. We rely on oil to give us foreign currency. Without it, there will be a huge problem because Libyans depend 100% on imports from abroad. So without oil revenue, prices will rise.
Oil is Libya's only real industry, but it has failed to match the production levels seen during the era of Muammar Gaddafi, who was overthrown in the revolution of 2011. The country should be as rich as Gulf countries, and untapped gas and oil fields have a potential to produce 2.4 million barrels a day, but it has suffered from chronic mismanagement and corruption.
So we have to show some transparency, we have to show some reorganization, and we cannot just, deny these allegations and stop, because the world cannot really ally completely with one side.
Fuel is heavily subsidized in Libya, costing around 4 US cents a litre. Unless the blockade is ended, that subsidy is likely to end, and prices are predicted to increase significantly, and that will only add to the suffering of the Libyan people.
Get Brexit done. That was a slogan that won it for the Prime Minister Boris Johnson. With uncertainty now out of the way, the pound popped higher and Britain left the European Union on January the 31st this year. But the kind of relationship the country has with the rest of Europe has yet to be decided. And the process is unlikely to start until March, and the UK still faces another cliff edge by the end of the year when it could leave without a deal. Well, according to Bloomberg Economics, the economic cost has already hit $170 billion. And by the end of the year, that could rise by another $100 billion. The UK economy is now 3% smaller than it could have been if it had maintained its relationship with the mainland. All right, let's take this on. Joining us from the studio in London is Hamish Muras, a senior currency strategist at OFX, and via Skype, Bilal Hafiz, who's founder and CEO of Macro Hive. Gentlemen, welcome to you both. Hamish, if I could start with you. So Boris Johnson has a big majority, of course, in Parliament. That strengthens his negotiation power, but it's far from straightforward, to say the least.
Certainly, he's got a big year ahead of him. Lots of stumbling blocks could be in the line for Boris Johnson. Just the other week, finally left the EU at the end of January, but he's got a big year ahead to sort out trade, fishing, environmental regulations, security, crime. But for our clients, the big questions will be around what happens to the pound and what happens to the euro over the next 12 months, and a lot of that will depend on trade talks between the UK, London, and Brussels.
All right, well, we'll get into all of that. So, Bilal, over to you. Boris cast Britain as the supercharged Superman of free trade. But is that Superman going to be flying off the edge of the cliff come December the 31st?
Well, that's a big sort of question mark. Of course, the EU is the largest trade partner of the UK. And at the moment, previously, when the UK was a member of the European Union, the UK was part of a free trade agreement with the EU. So whatever the agreement is with the European Union, at the end of this year, it will not be as free as it once was in terms of frictionless trade. So this will be a big challenge in terms of trade. Not only will the UK have to renegotiate a deal with the EU, it will also have to renegotiate trade agreements with multiple countries around the world too. So there's a lot of uncertainty here. Although Boris Johnson has talked about being a big champion of free trade, it will be quite a big challenge to get a similar type of agreement as the UK had with the EU before.
Bilal, do you think that the British Prime Minister has kind of tied his own hands by setting such a tight deadline?
Well, I mean, it could be. It depends, really. I mean, I think on balance, if you look at the way the European Union has come up with deals, if you remember during the height of the European crisis, when Italy, Spain, and many other countries were in crisis in 2011, 2012, often deals were made at the very last moment when there were, high pressure stakes. And so in that context, by setting such a tight deadline, it may not necessarily be a bad thing from a tactical perspective. And of course, the UK had, under Theresa May, had 2-3 years of negotiation, which didn't really come to much. So to some extent, I think it probably is prudent to have a different strategy and have these aggressive timelines. So in that sense, tactically, it may not be such a mistake to do so.
Right. And Hamish, when the UK government says it will not be rule takers, that it won't align with EU rules, how does that set up the whole negotiation process? How's that gone down in Brussels?
Well, it's not gone down too well in Brussels at all. Just this week, we've seen slight tweaks and changes in rules regarding MiFID II regulations in the EU, which caught the financial services in the City of London really on the back foot, and there was quite a worry about the alignment that we could have with Brussels and the EU moving forward. The result of which actually saw the pound depreciate quite a bit. But I think Bilal makes a really fantastic point about these sort of negotiations happening at the towards the deadline and really last-minute jobs. They happen behind closed doors as well. So sometimes the market and businesses are the last people to know and to find out the results of them. So there can be a lot of uncertainty, and we're anticipating a lot of uncertainty as we move into November and December of this year.
The thing is, Hamish, the UK is saying that EU rules and alignment with them is not even an issue of red lines. It's not even in the negotiating room.
Exactly. I couldn't exactly say what the details of are between Johnson and Michel Barnier, but as I mentioned, he does have a lot of cards he can still use. He can always ask for that extension if trade talks aren't progressing as well as they might be. But Mark Carney, I think, came out the other week and said that it wouldn't be in the interest necessarily of the UK to necessarily align too closely with the EU. Possible another big trade deal that the UK and Johnson would like to get over the line this year, I would imagine, would be one with the US as well.
Bilal, what's your take on this question of aligning with EU rules? Because is there any point at all in negotiation if there's, the UK saying on one hand they're not prepared to align and the EU say you have to?
Well, I think, part of this is, a negotiation, brinkmanship, where both sides set up quite extreme positions. But if you look at trade negotiations, often there is a compromise in the end. Although we have been talking about kind of a hard Brexit or a Canada deal and those sorts of references, if you look at deals between the European Union and Ukraine or European Union and Switzerland, there often is, some kind of compromise in terms of different types of sectors which have different rules. And so, one can easily come up with a trade deal where certain sectors are aligned and other sectors are not. There is also a question of semantics as well. Boris Johnson has been very clear that there will be no regulatory alignment. At the same time, you could end up with an eventual outcome where there is alignment, but a different word is used. So, shared rule book and those sorts of things. So there's a lot to consider here. And also, more generally, one has to also think about what the objectives and the goals are of the Boris Johnson government. Is it to Is it to put primacy towards a trade deal, or is it more sort of regional development within the UK? And does that take, does that take priority over other aspects of economic policy?
And Bilal, what about, is it possible that the UK government could weaponise, say, the budget? It's coming up on March 11th. Could we expect some sort of stimulus from there to help things along?
Well, I think certainly the budget will be a central part of the government's policy, and I do expect some quite big programs to be announced. At the same time, the government has constantly talked about staying within budget rules and so on. So there could well be more of a kind of reallocation of the budget. But at this stage, at least, it does seem like there'll be some quite significant increases in public spending towards the health service, of course, towards education, but perhaps most importantly towards the regions as well, big infrastructure programs and so on. So there'll be at least a redistribution of government spending towards regions outside of London, but also there should be a sort of net increase in spending too. So in that sense, it will be weaponized, and the hope for the government will be it would offset any weakness that we could see from uncertainty around trade negotiations.
Well, it's going to be an interesting year ahead. Do appreciate your time, Bilal Hafiz and Hamish Muris. Thanks very much indeed. All right, now, South Africa's governing African National Congress is moving to nationalise the central bank. But many are concerned that could scare away foreign investment. Harry Matassa reports now from Johannesburg.
Kidiboni Mohlolo says everything is getting increasingly expensive in South Africa, and even basic goods are now a luxury. She has never had a job and has 2 boys to feed, clothe and send to school. All of them sleep in this one-room shack on the same bed.
Sometimes I don't have money to buy the food, and now the school's open. I don't have to buy the kids for uniform, I'm struggling.
More than 25 years since apartheid ended in South Africa, government's affirmative action plans and black economic empowerment policies have failed to stop growing inequality and poverty. Now some politicians are proposing land, the mines and the country's central bank be nationalised. Unlike most central banks in the world, South Africa's is privately owned. The ruling African National Congress insists nationalising the bank is the only way to ensure wealth is redistributed more fairly. Nationalisation is a sensitive topic in South Africa. Some people feel nationalising the central bank will scare away investors and further weaken the country's already struggling economy.
What nationalisation would allow the ANC to do is to print money effectively and cause a hyperinflation of the kind that we've seen in Zimbabwe, of the kind that we saw between the wars in the Weimar Republic and various other European countries, that we've seen across history. And the reasons that they might want to do that are that the country is basically running out of money.
At the moment, some state-owned companies essential to the economy are in trouble. South African Airways is in financial crisis and has had to suspend some domestic and international flights. And power company Eskom is $30 billion in debt and struggling to maintain electricity supplies. Mining companies are warning that crisis could push the country into a recession.
We need to also a little bit be fair here. Not everything in this country is dysfunctional. And we can pinpoint to the reasons why these dysfunctional things have actually imploded and collapsed. We do have a problem of corruption. We do have that. And the only way to deal with corruption is not to say that the state should never own anything. It's to sort out corruption. Corruption is not a South African phenomenon. It's a global phenomenon.
President Cyril Ramaphosa is under pressure to revive investor confidence and boost economic growth. But he has to balance 2 sides, those who favour encouraging the growth of private businesses and many politicians in the ruling ANC party who are calling for more black economic empowerment policies, including taking land for redistribution without compensating the owners.
And with that, that is our show for this week. If you'd like to comment on anything that you've seen, you can, of course, tweet me at Nick Clark Al Jazz is the address. Please use the hashtag AJCTC or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. But there's more for you online, of course, at aljazeera.com/CTC, and that will take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. I'm Nick Clark from Counting the Cost. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.